Hi, Dr. Yass here. In this video, I want to discuss two specific diagnoses that are given really commonly for people having neck pain. And I want to make this extremely clear. If this is the diagnosis that you're being given to be treated based on, I simply want you to run the other way from the person that gave you the diagnosis. These are two diagnoses with no meaning whatsoever, and yet there is somewhat of an acceptance of them as being legitimate. So you continue to get treatment based on these diagnoses, but I want you to understand why they are actually baseless, meaningless, and for the practitioner to give it as a diagnosis and not recognize that should make you suspect of that person's capacity to resolve your pain. Okay. So before I name the two diagnoses, let me just point out that if you like these videos I'm producing, then please give them thumbs up. If you like my YouTube channel, Dr. Mitchell Yass, then by all means subscribe so you can get notifications when new videos are added or when I am live on YouTube. If you want to get in touch with me, you can do so by emailing me at drmitch@mitchellyas.com or going to my website to schedule a Yas Method Zoom session. The Yas Method can be used just as effectively virtually as it can in person. I happen to live in Jacksonville, Florida. If you're in the area, you want to stop by, you want some treatment, by all means. But if you're anywhere else in the world and you would like to benefit from the only true logical method for diagnosing and treating pain, then you can schedule a Zoom session at my website, which is livewithoutpains.com. Live without pains, it's plural.com. It'll be in the description of the video. So with that out of the way, let's talk about these two diagnoses. The first one is cervicogenic neck pain. Servogenic neck pain. Now, let's just very briefly talk about what a diagnosis is and what it must include to be considered a legitimate diagnosis. First, you must identify a tissue in distress with the diagnosis. What is pain? Pain is an indication of a tissue in distress. The tissue in distress is eliciting the symptom to create conscious awareness, make you aware that the tissue is in distress, so an intervention can be performed to resolve the distress of this tissue. Once the distress is resolved, the tissue no longer has to emit the emergency distress signal of pain, so it stops, right? So the first thing you better do in your diagnosis is identify a tissue, a bone, a muscle, a nerve, a herniated disc, stenosis, something. You got to be able to identify a tissue. So please tell me what the tissue is in the diagnosis servogenic neck pain. Is it a nerve? Is it a muscle? Is it a bone? Is it a ligament? What is it? The answer is there is no tissue identified. Well, if you don't even get the first part of creating a proper diagnosis, which is identifying a tissue, right off the bat, the person providing that diagnosis, you kind of have to lose faith in the person. And by the way, when I say this, I'm not saying that the person's a bad person, an evil person, a malicious person. My point to you would be that you want to start thinking that maybe the person doesn't know what they just don't know, right? So they're giving the diagnosis servogenic neck pain with the best intention. They just don't know that it's a meaningless diagnosis because they're doing what they're educated and trained to do. You got to start wrapping your head around this idea. It's not the person's fault that you're not getting resolved, you're not having your symptoms corrected and the proper tissue identified. It's the educational system, and these people just do what they're educated and trained to do. I mean, it's just the reality of life. So the first problem with servogenic neck pain is that no tissue is identified. The second part of a proper diagnosis is that the symptoms being experienced must match the symptoms that would be created if the identified tissue were to elicit symptoms. So every tissue creates a specific symptom. So if you pick the right tissue, if you've identified the right tissue, then the symptoms you're experiencing are the symptoms that that tissue creates when it is irritated, in distress, right? That has to make sense. So again, with the diagnosis servogenic neck pain, what's the symptoms that you would expect servogenic neck pain to make if it was in distress? Well, since it's not really a tissue, the diagnosis is kind of a basket diagnosis. Any symptom you have in the neck region will do. I'll use that diagnosis if you have pain on the left side, the right side, in the middle, off to the side. Is it stabbing, burning? Is it referred? Don't worry about it. I'll just use servogenic neck pain as the catch-all. And that's the point. That's the point you have to understand, is that the diagnoses that are oftentimes given are given because you don't know anything different. And since it can be used in this very generic mechanism, okay, well, as far as the person's concerned, it works for them because their intent is to treat you. By the way, when you break down the term servogenic neck pain, break the phrase down. Servo obviously is neck, cervical. Genic is genus, or origin. So the diagnosis of servogenic neck pain simply means that the origin of your neck pain is somewhere in the cervical region. Well, that's not a diagnosis. That's an indication of a symptom. Saying you have servogenic neck pain is enough, is the equivalent of just saying, yeah, you have neck pain. We got that. But you still haven't identified the tissue in distress emitting that symptom. Okay? So please, if you go to any person, regardless of their clinical background, regardless of what they say they can do for you, and the diagnosis they're going to treat you based on is servogenic neck pain, please walk away. Just say, it's been nice knowing you. I got to go. Because anyone willing to give that diagnosis clearly is not serious about trying to identify the tissue in distress, eliciting your symptoms, which is the only way that you're going to end the symptoms, by treating the tissue in distress, creating those very symptoms. Okay? So that's servogenic neck pain. The other one, which is really big, and there's a lot of money in this diagnosis, is whiplash. Now, people get car accidents, or they do some sort of type of activity where there's a quick, jerky motion. They end up with neck pain, and the diagnosis given is whiplash. Let's go back to the concepts. For it to be a viable diagnosis, what is the tissue in distress? What is the identified tissue creating the pain in the phrase whiplash? I'm not aware of any tissue called whiplash. I'm pretty sure I can go to any atlas that exists and look in the cervical region, and I'm not going to find a tissue named whiplash. So that doesn't work. In terms of the symptoms being experienced matching the symptoms that would be created by the identified tissue, the supposed tissue in distress, well, again, what are the specific symptoms that are associated with the phrase whiplash? Anything. Again, that's the point. That's the point. So as long as you're having some sort of symptom in your neck, and let's say you were in a motor vehicle accident, we're 10 years out, and you're still having symptoms in the neck, I could still use the diagnosis as whiplash. And people buy it. I treated people who have had a motor vehicle accident years earlier, And I say, why are you still having pain today? And they say, well, I was in a car accident. It's whiplash. I'm sorry to laugh, but it's from a logical standpoint, it's really preposterous. It's just such full-hearted nonsense. So we can be quite clear, whiplash is a mechanism. It's a mechanism. It relates to the quick, jerky motion associated with the incident. But it's not a diagnosis, because a diagnosis represents a tissue in distress eliciting the very symptoms you're experiencing. It is not identifying a tissue. If you want to tell me it's a fractured vertebrae, then tell me that. If you want to, crazy enough, say it's a herniated disc or a pinched nerve, or maybe it's a strained muscle, maybe you tore a ligament, give me a tissue. Identify a tissue. Once you've identified the tissue, then you could start to break it down to see, are the symptoms you're experiencing the same that you would expect would exist if that is the tissue that is in distress? You see, once you get to this point of understanding the two elements of a diagnosis, it becomes very clear whether you're having the right tissue treated or not. That's why nobody really goes here. That's why the use of innocuous, generalized terms seems so effective and so widespread. I want you to start following the science of how to properly diagnose the cause of pain. And in the neck region or any other area, the Yas method states at its core, to identify or to achieve a proper diagnosis, you must first identify a tissue. Name a tissue that you believe is the tissue in distress, eliciting the very symptoms the person's experiencing, which are in fact coming from that tissue. Secondly, you must show that the symptoms being experienced are the very same symptoms that would exist if that identified tissue were to be in distress. Now, if you're using the MRI or X-ray and you're finding structural variations, I could tell you that you'll probably get the first part of the required two elements of a diagnosis to be achieved. You'll name a tissue, herniated disc, stenosis, arthritis, meniscal tear, labral tear, any fractured vertebrae, any of this stuff you'll get, right? The problem is that I've shown in over 28 years that in more than 99.99999% of cases, the symptoms the person was experiencing was not the symptoms you would expect if the tissue identified were in distress and creating symptoms. So by definition, the tissue identified wasn't the tissue creating the symptoms, period, end of story. Therefore, all the treatment in the world for that tissue wasn't going to resolve the symptoms being experienced. Therefore, the misdiagnosis of that tissue was responsible for the chronic pain being experienced. Diagnostic tests cannot find muscular causes, period. There are no medical specialties educated or trained to find muscular causes, period. In more than 98% of cases, I have shown that the cause of pain is muscular, period. That should guide you to an understanding as to why there's so much chronic pain and why no one's getting better, and why the use of diagnoses like Servogenic neck pain, which just is, it's basically identifying twice that your pain is in your neck, or whiplash, which is simply the identification of a mechanism, not a tissue in distress. It's simply identifying the mechanism by which the initial pain was created, are so embraced by the medical establishment, because as long as you're willing to accept them as some kind of generic basket diagnosis, you are never demanding that a practitioner provide you with the specific tissue that they think is creating your symptoms, which is the only way you're going to ever end your symptoms. You're going to have to treat the tissue in distress creating your symptoms. The Yass method interprets the body's presentation of symptoms. That's at the core of the method. It ignores diagnostic testing findings. Its basis is the understanding that the symptoms being experienced are being created by the tissue in distress, and that by interpreting the symptoms, I can then correlate the tissues that are responsible for those types of symptoms, whether it's bone, muscle, or nerve. So after you've had pain for a long enough period of time under the diagnosis of servogenic neck pain or whiplash, hopefully, if you see this video, it'll start to make sense why you've had pain for such a sustained period of time and why you really need to get the Yas method. The only method that exists, as far as I'm concerned, that at its core diagnostic model utilizes the interpretation of the body's presentation of symptoms to identify the tissue in distress, eliciting the symptoms you are experiencing. In 98% of cases, the cause is muscular, which allows you to utilize progressive resistance, strength training, isolated strength training techniques to resolve the muscular deficits, the force deficits that are continuing to allow you to try to perform your activities and the muscles continue to strain. Eventually, the only way you're going to resolve your pain if you have a muscular cause is to cause the force outputs of the muscles to be greater than the force requirements of your activities. That's when you live pain-free and, most importantly, fully functional. All right? I hope that this video was educational. I hope it breaks things down in terms that the layperson can understand, which is the most important thing there is. And I hope it guides you and assists you in coming to conclusions about what is the right diagnosis, how you get the right diagnosis, and ultimately how you get the right treatment. And hopefully that you recognize the Yass method is the only true path. So with that said, I would like to wish you a pain-free and fully functional life. And hopefully I'll see you, whether in person or virtually, sometime in the future. So for now, Dr. Mitchell Yass wishing you a happy, fully functional life. Bye-bye for now.